It's the worst. All right, so we are starting the nervous system, which is kind of dense. We gloss over a lot of stuff. But just like every chapter, before we can learn the physiology and the hard stuff about how nerves work, we have to learn the anatomy. And so we have to learn the names of these cell structures, the names of the features, the names of the pathways. And so that's what this chapter is about, is getting us really, giving us descriptions of the anatomy of the nervous system. And so there are portions of this that will sound very similar, because the nervous system and the musculature system, or the muscles, have a lot of similarities. But because we're in the neural system, cranial or spinal or peripheral, we kind of give them a little bit different terms. You'll see what I mean. So first, your nervous system isn't sort of on its own. It's interacting with other portions of your body, and most closely with the endocrine. The endocrine is the system where you're releasing hormones or releasing substances. So between the endocrine and the nervous system, you keep your body in homeostasis. You can act and react to certain things, temperature fluctuation, water balance, calcium level homeostasis, all of those things. And so the nervous system integrates functions of organs, tissues, and cells all together to do its job. Now, mainly the nervous system is just made up of the brain, the spinal cord, and all the little spidery nerves that come off of it. These nerves are going to be innervating and interacting with different types of cells. Now, when we learn the nervous system, we can divide it based on location, or we can divide it based on what it does. And so we're going to start with location first. Historically, when gross anatomists were first studying the nervous system of organisms, they separated it into the central and peripheral. The central, or CNS, central nervous system, is the brain and spinal column. And so your brain here, and then the spinal cord that comes off the brain and extends all the way down your vertebrae. Branching off of that, to go to all the various muscles and organs elsewhere, is the peripheral nerves, or the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And so if we're talking about nerves in the brain, we refer to them as cranial nerves. And if we're discussing nerves in the spinal column or spinal cord, we call them spinal nerves. And so your nervous system itself is kind of wrapped around your body, protect the brain, and the rest of it kind of extends out. It's organized in a special way to detect stimuli, to detect changes both internally and externally, and allow yourself to make decisions to maintain balance. And so your brain or your nerves evaluate sensory information and decide, is that enough to initiate a response? Most of this is handled in the background. It's background processes that you don't have to think about. Now, there are some things that we do, touch something hot, we sense that, we pull our hand away, we make that decision, but a lot of it is automatic. Whether our heart needs to slow down, whether we're getting too hot or too cold, and all the reactions from that, whether you haven't had breakfast, so you have to start breaking down your glycogen. And so all of those are things that we don't have to think about, because can you imagine if we did, how just overwhelmed we would be? And so our brains aren't set up that way. A lot of that kind of is handled in the background. And so because of that, we don't have to break up our system into just central and peripheral. We could break it up into somatic and autonomic. And so there are other ways to separate the nervous system. If we're calling it central nervous system, we're referencing the brain and the spinal cord. They're the main players. If we're calling it peripheral, we mean all the nerves that lie in the outer regions or on the outside, the periphery, the edges. We learn a few of our cranial nerves during neural anatomy, one of the last weeks of class, which is just in 3 weeks basically, you're almost done. We don't learn all of the cranial nerves and all of what they do. I will fully admit I don't remember all of them. There are several, and there's a mnemonic device you can use to help you memorize all of them, but I haven't had to teach it ever, and so I don't have them memorized. But if you go into nursing or pre-med or other types of healthcare where you will be dealing with the nervous system, you will have to memorize them. But we don't for this class. There are just a couple we have to know where they are. The spinal nerves come off the spinal cord, and there are so many that we don't have to learn individual names. We point out big packets, but we don't have to learn names. So your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, if you think about it, are sending information toward the brain or away from the brain or from other nerve integration centers. It doesn't always have to be the brain. And so it's like a highway, information going this way or that way. And so there are two words we can use to describe which way information is going. There's the afferent pathways or afferent division and efferent division. Some people pronounce afferent and efferent to where they almost sound exactly the same. They say afferent and efferent. I prefer to say afferent and efferent so we don't get the spelling mixed up. And so that's how you can say it. If you ever hear it efferent, it's not wrong. It's just we like to say efferent so we can spell it correctly. And so afferent consists of all the incoming sensory pathways, and efferent consists of information going outward, all outgoing motor pathways, like toward the muscle, for example. Now, I almost don't want to say this because I'm going to lead you down the wrong path, but if there are two words that people get mixed up, it's afferent and efferent. Well, why is it? Well, afferent starts with an A. We just learned artery away. We're getting ready to learn axon away. So we try to memorize afferent away and don't do that. Afferent does not mean away from the central nervous system, it means toward. And that's a vocab word that is always, always missed. So make sure that you practice those a couple times and understand what they mean, because it's real easy to miss, especially once we just start using it as, a word in our sentences. And so this, if we're going to break it up into what the system does, we can start with the somatic system, which includes the integration centers that receive info and then generate that efferent response. Do you remember what somatic or soma means in biology? We talked about somatic cells. If you took biology, we talked about somatic division. Soma or somatic means body. Soma means a body, like a structure. And so soma is in reference to the body itself. And so these are the skeletal muscles, the voluntary structures, things that we can move. And so the somatic motor division carries information back to the somatic effectors down to your skeletal muscles and lets us move them. And so the sensory division carries feedback info to the somatic integration centers in the central nervous system and allows us to make those decisions. If we touch something sharp, something hot, should we pull our hand away? Things that we have control over. Oppositely, we also have the background processes, the things that we don't necessarily have direct control over and we wouldn't want control over. And so we call this the autonomic nervous system. If you think autonomic, automatic. And so the efferent division of the autonomic nervous system is carrying info to the autonomic or visceral effectors. Do you remember what visceral means? Like viscera? Like visceral pleura, visceral pericardium. What does visceral mean? Like eviscerate. Any guesses? What does visceral mean? Doesn't necessarily mean side. What? Not covering. Your viscera is a generic term to mean organ. So your visceral is your organ sensor, so things that you don't necessarily have direct control of or don't want to. So autonomic carries information to the autonomic or your visceral effectors. So things like your glands, tissues, smooth muscle, stuff that's going to carry out its functions on its own, things that you don't have to think about. Now we can divide the autonomic nervous system into two regions, or two, not regions, but divisions, functions. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, think speed up. Not everything speeds up, but sympathetic is more like a fight or flight. You know, everything's on alert. Do I have to stand my ground or do I have to run away? You know, your heart increases, your breathing increases, your digestion stops completely because your body is diverting all central processes to survive. So sympathetic is the experiences you get when you're scared or when you're nervous or when you're trying to sense, like, how do I get out of the situation? Once that is over or subsided, or we try to deal with it, we have to begin to shut some of that stuff down. So then we have the parasympathetic responses that slow our heart rate back down, stop us from sweating so much, start our digestion back up. And so sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and repair. So these are both automatic. You don't really have control over how fast your heart goes, even if you can sit there and you can do breathing exercises or what have you, but you are sort of allowing your parasympathetic to take over. You're not necessarily thinking, slow my heart down, right? It's doing it automatically. And so the autonomic nervous system can be broken up into two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so you'll want to be familiar enough with those 6 terms that if we said them, you don't have to think about what central nervous system means or what the parasympathetic division means. We now have to go through the anatomy of the structures in the nervous system. The nervous system, the big nerve cells themselves are called neurons, but we're going to start with the accessory structures. And so there are a bunch of cells that support the neurons, more numerous really than your neurons. They're called glial cells, glia, or sometimes neuroglia. And there are 5 major types. 2 of them are essentially the same thing, just one's in the central nervous system and one's in the peripheral. But we have astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes, which is a fun word to say, and Schwann cells. And so they're named better, their shape and what they do. So astrocytes kind of look like a star, astro. Microglia are this big phagocytic globular cell. Your ependymal cells have little cilia on them. Oligodendrocytes, dendro or dendritic means branching, and oligo means scanty. So oligodendrocytes don't have many branches, but they have a couple. And then we have our Schwann cells, which can wrap around our neurons, our oligodendrocyte. I'm sorry, our Schwann cells and our neuron cells. So let's start with the astrocytes. They're the most numerous. They look like a star. They have a lot of branches off of them. They're in your central nervous system, so around the brain and spinal cord. They have cell extensions that connect to both neurons and capillaries, which is important. You have a barrier over your brain, multiple layers. You have a barrier over your brain and a barrier over your capillaries. We call this the blood-brain barrier. Your blood capillaries do not directly lay on the brain. It's not a direct transfer. We have to pass nutrients through diffusion. And so not everything can pass through the blood-brain barrier, which is good because you don't want just anything in your system to go straight to your brain. Some things can, some things are small enough to do so. But the astrocytes are the ones that are transferring those nutrients from the blood to the neurons. So they're the middleman in between what's going on in the capillaries and what's going on in the neurons. So you have to have a lot of them. They also work at synapses to recycle neurotransmitters. Does anyone, if you took psychology or human growth and development, or even this class when we talked about the muscle lecture, anybody remember what a synapse is? Or can you give me a simple definition of a synapse, or what synapse means? What? I go to my good ear. What? Yeah, just like what does it do? Just real simply. Just basic. And you can be wrong too. I mean, that's the point of learning. Oftentimes when you're wrong, you recognize you're wrong and you can fix it. So. Good, it's a space. Do you know what's going on in this space? Think about when we learned about muscle contraction. We talked about acetylcholine being released at the motor nerve endings with plates. Remember? Have you had psychology yet? Growth and development a little bit? Yeah. You briefly talk about this. Your nervous system doesn't directly talk to things. So it's not like you send an electrical shock from your brain straight to the muscle. Oftentimes you send a response, an electrical impulse that jumps and jumps and jumps and jumps, and it hits a location that if you have enough of a signal, it's going to release neurotransmitters, little vesicles of hormones. And so if you have enough of those neurotransmitters, they're going to be picked up by the receptors on the other side of the synapse, across the synaptic cleft. And so that, if you have enough of those, initiates the next response. So that's basically how your nervous system talks to each other. And you have tons of these everywhere. And so this neurotransmitter could be anything. We're talking about in the brain, it could be serotonin. And so it releases this hormone picked up by the other and initiates another response. You don't want to waste these. And so you also have these astrocytes. There's my astrocytes, recycling those neurotransmitters to make sure that you don't waste them. And so this is the reuptake process. And so we're absorbing them. And so if you're familiar, sometimes some people are really great at making all the neurotransmitters they need. Some of us are not. And so you can take all kinds of medications, but specifically if we're talking about serotonin, there's a very common class of medications that are called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So you don't recycle and it builds up and you hope that you make more. That way, if you already have a lower amount, you can make more and it can go over. And things like serotonin are the good ones because serotonin, in our personality traits, serotonin keeps us away from neuroticism and anger and irritability and depression and moves us back toward the middle ground. And so you can use these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to help you with all kinds of stuff. If you have depression, or it can help you with anxiety, or it can just help you, keeping your cool, keeping calm during these situations. So they're a very common class of medications. But people always ask this question, and somebody even asked last night, with those medications, we also have those receptors in our digestive system. And so if you take those medications, it often affects that as well, because our digestion and our brain have those same responses, have those same receptors. Sometimes they call the gut the second brain. So that's why sometimes if you're not feeling well, you're not eating healthy foods, or you have something else going on, in your digestive system, it kind of affects your mood as well. Throughout your central nervous system, along with the astrocytes, you also have a bunch of these microglia in the central nervous system. These are usually stationary. They've gotten lodged and they're going to stay there until something happens, until there's inflamed tissue, and they can move about and carry out phagocytosis. They can consume things. They're used early on, so right after fetal development and as a kid when you're learning how to walk and talk and move around, you have way more neurons, way more little branches than you could possibly need. And so if you think about, your neurons being like an information pathway, it's a lot more efficient to have a major well-run highway than it is to have 6 or 7 side roads, you know, dirt, gravel roads. It's faster to go down the main highway. And so you kind of weed out the little side roads that you don't need as you age. And so by about 5 or 6, you know, your brain is pretty solidified, but we can make new processes all the time. And I'll get there in a second. But we can weed out these other little cells. And so I will give 5 real bonus points onto the whatever exam you want. How about that? Nobody got it last night because we've talked about this once before. It was on a slide. But I will add 5 bonus points to whatever exam you want if you can tell me what type of cell these microglia come from. Because we have definitely said it once before, and it was in the last unit, so it was in your last packet. It's phagocytic. It moves around and got lodged. So what type of cell does this arise from? What? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. I cannot hear you for whatever reason. If you feel comfortable, let me read your lips. Ooh, very close. That's not quite it. Very close though. Yeah. Not basophils. You're on the right track, but that's not it. Neutrophil? It's not neutrophil. What? You're so close. Yes, that's it. All right. So we have those special cells during the hemopoietic system that could turn into other stuff. So they could turn into neutrophils, into basophils, but those types of cells moved around. They were highly phagocytic, moved around and got lodged. And we said they could become the Kupffer cells in the liver or the microglia in the nervous system. So take your pick and we'll put it on there. So they're phagocytic, they consume things. So they're like your neutrophils, like your basophils, they're going to consume these things. Yes. And so during the hemopoietic line, you have the monocyte line that can develop and become other things. They get lodged and stuff and become other things. So good job. At least you all said blood cells. Last night I was getting all kinds of ridiculous things. Like, no, it's the system, it was the ones we just learned. But anyway, moving on. So you also have ependymal cells inside of cavities. We're going to learn when we get to neural anatomy. You have a bunch of ventricles, open spaces filled with fluid inside your cranial cavity, inside your brain. And so inside of these cavities, you have these ependymal cells with little finger-like cilia to help move that fluid along and pick up material inside of it. And so they look a lot like epithelial cells. They look like pseudostratified epithelial, but they are ependymal and have those actual cilia. Now the next two are very similar. It just depends on what system we're in. So if we start with central nervous system, brain and spinal column, we have these special cells called oligodendrocytes or oligodendrocytes. They're smaller than astrocytes and they have fewer processes. Oligo means scanty, and so they have branches, but not very many of them. And so all these oligodendrocytes, they're going to be wrapping around nerve fibers, holding kind of tissues together, and they're producing what's called a myelin sheath. In the peripheral nervous system, so all your nerves off of the central nervous system, you have very similar cells that also make a myelin sheath. So they're supporting these cells in this protective coating, but they're called Schwann cells, or if we move away from honorific names and start learning descriptive names, we're now starting to call them neurolimocytes. Schwann cells for now. So what is myelin? Myelin is this protective fatty substance that coats your neurons, that helps protect and speed up these information pathways. If you have a really strong connection in your brain, it should be myelinated. We won't get to it in this lecture, to be in the next 3, but there are a lot of neural pathologies, Alzheimer's, MS, Parkinson's, that affect the myelin. And so they affect how fast the signals can be passed. Yeah.